The rain came down in sheets so thick that Bronson Nash could barely see 10 feet ahead of him as he guided his horse down the muddy trail toward Awahi, Nevada. But through the gray curtain of water, he spotted something that made him pull his mount to a halt. A woman struggled up the path carrying an armload of soaked firewood, her thin shawl plastered to her shoulders, her dress heavy with rainwater as she stumbled through the mud. It was late October of 1878, and Bronson knew without a doubt that the pitiful bundle of wet sticks she carried would never be enough to see her through the brutal Nevada winter that was already showing its teeth. He watched her for a moment longer, his jaw tightening beneath his thick beard as she nearly fell, catching herself at the last second while somehow managing to keep hold of the wood. Everything about the scene struck him as wrong. A woman alone, clearly struggling, with winter breathing down her neck and inadequate supplies. Bronson had spent the last 8 years in these mountains, trapping and hunting, living a solitary life that suited him just fine after the war had taken everything he loved. But something about this woman's determined struggle through the downpour stirred something in his chest that he had thought long dead. He urged his horse forward, the massive buckskin gelding picking its way carefully through the mud. As he drew closer, the woman must have heard the horse's approach because she turned, her eyes going wide at the sight of him. Bronson knew what he looked like: 6 feet 4 inches of solid muscle, shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway, with dark hair that hung past his collar and a beard that he trimmed maybe twice a year if he remembered. His buckskin jacket was dark with rain, and his hat dripped water in a steady stream. "Madam," he said, his voice rough from disuse. He had not spoken to another soul in near 3 weeks. She took a step back, clutching her firewood like a shield. Her face was pale, her lips tinged blue with cold, and her eyes were the color of storm clouds, a gray so light they were nearly silver. Even soaked and shivering, she held herself with a dignity that commanded respect. "I do not need any help," she said, her voice steady despite the shaking of her body. "I am managing just fine." Bronson looked pointedly at the small bundle of wet wood in her arms, then at the sky that showed no sign of clearing, then back at her. "That wood is soaked through. It will not burn worth a damn, begging your pardon. It will dry," she insisted, lifting her chin. "Not before you freeze." He swung down from his horse and she took another step back. He held up his hands, showing he meant no harm. "I am not going to hurt you, madam. But I cannot in good conscience ride past and let you struggle when I can help. I told you, I am managing." "Where is your home?" She hesitated, clearly not wanting to give him any information, but finally she gestured down the trail toward where it curved around a stand of pine trees. "Just beyond that bend. A cabin." "Your husband at home?" The question made her face go carefully blank. "That is none of your business." Which meant no, there was no husband, or at least not one who was present. Bronson felt his protective instincts rising even stronger. A woman alone in these mountains with winter coming and no proper firewood was a recipe for disaster. "I will tell you what," he said, keeping his voice gentle despite its natural roughness. "You go on home and get yourself dry and warm. I am going to cut you some proper firewood and stack it where you can get to it easy. You do not have to talk to me. You do not have to thank me. You do not even have to look at me if you do not want to. But I am going to make sure you have wood enough to last the winter." "I cannot pay you," she said quietly, and he heard the shame in her voice that nearly broke his heart. "Did I ask for payment? Why would you help a stranger?" Bronson was quiet for a moment, rainwater running down his face. "Because someone should have helped my sister when she needed it, and nobody did. She froze to death in a winter storm 3 years after the war ended, alone in a cabin not much different from yours, I would wager. I cannot help her now, but I can help you. Something in his words made her eyes soften just slightly. She studied his face, looking for deception or ulterior motives, and he let her look. He had nothing to hide. "My name is Grace Brennan," she said finally. "The cabin is mine. I have been living there since May. Bronson Nash. Folks call me Nash mostly when they call me anything at all." He touched the brim of his hat. "Now please, Miss Brennan, go get yourself dry before you catch your death. I will be here chopping wood. You can watch from your window if it makes you feel safer." She seemed to war with herself for another moment, then finally nodded. "There is a small shed behind the cabin. You can stack the wood there where it will stay dry." Then she turned and walked away, still carrying her pitiful bundle of wet sticks, her back straight despite her exhaustion. Bronson watched her go, then led his horse toward the cabin. It was small but well-maintained, with a stone chimney and a roof that looked like it had been recently patched. Someone had tried to plant a garden, though the season was too far gone for anything to still be growing. He tied his horse under a makeshift shelter attached to the shed she had mentioned, making sure the animal was comfortable. Then he took stock of the situation. There was an axe leaning against the shed, the blade dull and the handle wrapped in cloth where it had started to splinter. He shook his head. The woman had been trying to chop wood with this sorry excuse for a tool. He retrieved his own axe from his pack, the blade sharp enough to shave with, the handle worn smooth from years of use. Then he looked around for suitable trees. The rain continued to pour down as Bronson worked, but he barely noticed. Physical labor had always been where he found peace, and there was something satisfying about the solid thunk of the axe biting into wood, the clean split as the log fell into pieces. He chose dead trees and fallen timber first, wood that was already seasoned and would burn better than green wood. Within an hour he had felled 3 good-sized trees and was working on cutting them into manageable pieces. From the corner of his eye, he saw the cabin door open a crack. Grace Brennan was watching him, just as he had suggested. He did not look directly at her, not wanting to spook her, but he was glad she had made it inside and hopefully had gotten into dry clothes. The work was hard and wet, but Bronson had done harder things in worse conditions. He lost himself in the rhythm of it, cut and split, stack and repeat. His shoulders burned pleasantly, his back and arms working in harmony with the axe. The pile of split wood began to grow beside the shed. As the afternoon wore on, the rain finally began to ease, though the sky remained a solid sheet of gray. Bronson had worked up a good sweat despite the cold, his shirt sticking to his back beneath his jacket. The pile of firewood was now taller than he was and twice as long, but he was not finished yet. Winter in the Nevada mountains could last from October clear through April, and he wanted to make sure Grace Brennan had enough wood to see her through even the worst of it. The cabin door opened again, wider this time, and Grace stepped out onto the small porch. She had changed into a dry dress, a faded blue calico, and had her dark blonde hair pulled back in a simple bun. She was wrapped in a shawl that looked only slightly warmer than the one she had been wearing earlier. "Mr. Nash," she called out, her voice carrying across the clearing. He stopped mid-swing, setting the axe head on the ground and leaning on the handle. "Yes, madam. It has been hours." "You should take a break. I have coffee if you would like some." Bronson hesitated. He had not intended to impose on her hospitality, but the offer of hot coffee was mighty tempting, and truth be told, he would not mind a chance to sit down for a few minutes. "That would be much appreciated, madam." She nodded and disappeared back inside, leaving the door open a few inches in invitation. Bronson took a moment to wipe the worst of the mud from his boots on the edge of the porch before stepping inside. The cabin was small, just one room with a loft above that probably served as a sleeping area. But it was clean and tidy, with simple furniture that looked homemade but sturdy. A small table with 2 chairs sat near the fireplace, where a meager fire struggled to provide heat. Bronson could see that she had been burning her furniture bit by bit. One of the chairs had no back, and the legs of the table were uneven where pieces had been cut away. Grace poured coffee from a pot on the fire into 2 tin cups. Her hands shook slightly as she handed one to him, though whether from cold, exhaustion, or nervousness he could not tell. "Thank you," he said, wrapping his large hands around the cup and feeling the warmth seep into his cold fingers. He took a sip and nearly groaned. It was weak, probably the same grounds boiled 3 or 4 times, but it was hot and wet and exactly what he needed. "You have been working for 3 hours," Grace said, sitting down in the remaining whole chair. "I did not expect you to do so much." "Still have more to do," Bronson said. "Want to make sure you have enough. You have already cut more wood than I could have managed in a month." She looked down at her cup. "I do not understand why you are doing this for me. You do not know me." Bronson was quiet for a moment, standing because there was nowhere for him to sit and he would not take the only chair she had. "I told you about my sister. That was true. But there is more to it than that, I suppose. I have lived in these mountains for 8 years, mostly alone, mostly by choice. The war made me not fit for regular society anymore, but living alone does not mean I have to be heartless. When I see someone who needs help, and I have the ability to give it, seems to me it would be sinful not to." "The war," she repeated softly. "You fought for the North. Lost most of my family in the fighting one way or another. When it was over, I could not go back to farming in Missouri. Too many ghosts, so I came west and found these mountains, and they have suited me well enough." "I am sorry," Grace said, and she sounded like she meant it. "I lost people too. My parents to fever 5 years ago and my brother at a place called Spotsylvania." "I was at Spotsylvania," Bronson said quietly. "It was hell on earth." They were both silent for a moment, 2 people who understood loss in a way that bonded them despite being strangers an hour before. "What brought you to Awahi?" Bronson asked, changing the subject to something less painful. Grace took a sip of her coffee, gathering her thoughts. "I was engaged to be married. He was a miner, working the silver claims. We were supposed to wed in June, but in May there was an accident in the mine. He was killed along with 7 other men." Her voice was steady, but Bronson could hear the grief underneath. "I had already sold everything I owned back in Ohio to come out here. When he died, I found out that this cabin was all he had. He had won it in a card game. So I moved in, because I had nowhere else to go and no money to go there with even if I did." "You have been here alone since May." "Yes. I took in washing and mending at first, and I still do when there is work to be had, but the town is small and most people do their own. I have been trying to prepare for winter, but," she gestured helplessly, "I am not very good at things like chopping wood. I grew up in a city. The axe feels wrong in my hands no matter how I hold it." Bronson felt a surge of admiration for her. She had been dealt a terrible hand and was doing her best to play it with dignity and determination. "You have done better than most would. The cabin is in good repair. You have not given up. That takes strength." "It does not feel like strength. Most days it just feels like stubbornness." "Sometimes those are the same thing." He drained the last of his coffee and set the cup on the table. "I should get back to it. Want to finish before full dark if I can. Mr. Nash, I cannot thank you enough." "Just Nash is fine, and you do not need to thank me. Just make sure you stay warm this winter." "All right," she nodded, and he thought he saw the shine of tears in her eyes, though she blinked them away quickly. He touched his hat brim to her and went back outside to continue his work. The afternoon stretched into evening, and still Bronson chopped wood. His shoulders and back were screaming now, but he kept going. The pile grew and grew until it filled the small shed, and he had to start a second pile under the shelter where his horse stood. He worked until it was too dark to see properly, until his hands were covered in blisters, despite the calluses he already had, until the woodpile was so large that Grace Brennan could burn wood all day every day and still have enough to last through a harsh winter. When he finally stopped, truly finished, he was exhausted in a way that felt good and clean. He stood looking at his work, breathing hard, his muscles trembling with fatigue. It was full dark now, stars beginning to appear between the clouds as the weather finally cleared. The cabin door opened and Grace came out carrying a lantern. She held it up, illuminating the enormous stack of split wood, and her hand flew to her mouth. "Oh my Lord," she whispered. "This is enough for 2 winters, maybe 3. "Better too much than too little," Bronson said, his voice rough with exhaustion. She set the lantern down and turned to him, and in the golden light he could see tears streaming down her face. "I do not know what to say. This is the kindest thing anyone has ever done for me." "You do not have to say anything. Stay," she said suddenly. "Please. It is dark, you have worked all day, you must be exhausted. I do not have much, but I have a roof and I can make you supper. It is the least I can do." Bronson wanted to refuse, not wanting to impose further, but the truth was he was dead on his feet, and the thought of riding even the few miles to town was not appealing. "If you are sure you do not mind." "I am sure. Come inside, please." He followed her into the cabin, and she immediately began bustling around, adding wood to the fire from the small amount she had brought in earlier. "I know you just brought me enough wood to last until the second coming, but I should save this for when I really need it," she said, catching him looking. "I still have some of what I gathered." "Grace," he said gently, "that is what the wood is for, to burn, to keep you warm and alive. There is no sense in freezing now to save it for later." She looked at him, then at the fire, then at the door where the enormous woodpile waited. Something seemed to break loose in her then, some tension she had been holding for months, and she laughed. It was a slightly hysterical sound, but genuine. "You are right," she said. "You are absolutely right. I have been so worried about running out that I have been afraid to use what I have." She opened the cabin door and brought in an armload of the freshly split wood, the pieces still smelling of sap and clean wood. She built up the fire until it was blazing, filling the small cabin with warmth and light. Bronson felt himself relaxing in the heat, his cold, wet clothes beginning to steam. Grace noticed and bit her lip. "You should get out of those wet things. You will catch your death." She climbed up the ladder to the loft and came back down with a quilt. "I do not have any clothes that would fit you, but you could wrap up in this while your things dry by the fire." It was probably improper, but Bronson was too tired and cold to care much about propriety. He turned his back and stripped off his wet shirt and undershirt, draping them over the remaining chair to dry. His trousers were wet too, but he kept those on for modesty's sake, though he did take off his boots and socks. When he turned back around, Grace was studiously focused on something in her small cupboard, but he saw the way her eyes flicked toward him and then quickly away, and he wondered what she saw when she looked at him. Probably just a big, scarred, rough man who looked like he belonged in the mountains with the bears and wolves. He wrapped the quilt around his shoulders and sat down on the floor near the fire, feeling the warmth start to seep into his bones. Grace began preparing supper, which turned out to be a thin stew made with a few vegetables, and what looked like the last of a rabbit that had seen better days. She also made fry bread in a skillet, the dough sizzling in bacon grease. They ate in companionable silence, and Bronson tried not to notice how small her portions were, how she gave him the larger share without comment. The food was simple but good, seasoned well and cooked with care. When they were finished, Grace collected the dishes and washed them in a basin, and Bronson felt sleep tugging at him. "You can sleep by the fire," Grace said. "I will be in the loft. You have done so much today, the least I can do is give you a warm place to rest." "I appreciate it, madam." "Grace," she said, "if we are being informal enough for you to be sitting in my cabin wrapped in a quilt, you should call me Grace." "Grace," he repeated, liking the way her name felt in his mouth. "Then you should call me Bronson or Nash if you prefer." "Bronson," she said, and he liked the way she said it too, soft and careful. "Good night, Bronson, and thank you again. I know I keep saying it, but I cannot say it enough. Sleep well, Grace." She climbed the ladder to the loft, and he heard her settling in above him. He lay down on the hard floor, using his saddle bag as a pillow, and stared into the fire. He should leave in the morning, head back to his cabin higher in the mountains, get back to his solitary life. But something had shifted in him today, something he had not felt in years. For the first time since the war had ended, since he had lost everyone he loved, he felt connected to another human being. It was terrifying and wonderful at the same time. He fell asleep listening to the crackle of the fire and the soft sound of Grace's breathing from the loft above, and he slept better than he had in months. Bronson woke to the smell of coffee and the gray light of dawn filtering through the cabin's single window. He sat up, momentarily disoriented, then remembered where he was. His clothes were dry, stiff with dirt and wear but wearable. He dressed quickly while Grace was still in the loft, giving her privacy. "Good morning," she called down softly. "The coffee is hot if you want some." "Thank you." He poured himself a cup and stood by the fire, feeling the pleasant ache in his muscles from yesterday's work. It was a good ache, the kind that came from honest labor and helping someone who needed it. Grace climbed down from the loft, already dressed for the day in the same faded blue dress. Her hair was pulled back simply, and in the morning light he could see that she was younger than he had first thought, maybe 24 or 25 to his 32 years. She was pretty in a quiet way, with a face that was more interesting than beautiful, all fine bones and those startling gray eyes. "I should be getting on," Bronson said, though part of him did not want to leave. "Got my own cabin to prepare for winter." "Of course," Grace said, and he thought he heard disappointment in her voice, though maybe that was wishful thinking. "I will not keep you." They stood there awkwardly for a moment, two people who had formed an unexpected connection but did not know quite what to do with it. Finally, Bronson cleared his throat. "If you need anything this winter, anything at all, my cabin is about 8 miles north of here, up near the tree line. Anyone in town can point you in the right direction. I will be fine now, thanks to you. Still, if you need help, you come find me." He pulled on his jacket and hat, then paused at the door. "Grace, I know we just met, but I want you to know that if you get in trouble or if someone bothers you or if you just need help with something, I will come. You understand? You are not alone up here." Her eyes filled with tears again, and she nodded. "That means more than you know." He wanted to say more, wanted to tell her that he had not been able to stop thinking about her since he first saw her struggling in the rain, that something about her had gotten under his skin in a way he could not explain. But it was too soon, too much, and he did not have the words anyway. So he just touched his hat brim and walked outside. His horse was waiting patiently, and Bronson saddled him quickly. When he looked back at the cabin, Grace was standing in the doorway, wrapped in her shawl, watching him. He raised a hand in farewell, and she raised hers in return. Then he swung up into the saddle and rode away, though every instinct in his body was screaming at him to stay. The ride to town took less than an hour, and Bronson spent the entire time thinking about Grace Brennan. He told himself he had done a good deed, nothing more, and that he should forget about her and get on with his life. But he knew he was lying to himself. Something had changed yesterday, something fundamental, and there was no going back. Awahi, Nevada was a small mining town, rough and tumble like most mining towns, but relatively law-abiding thanks to a sheriff who did not tolerate nonsense. Bronson did not come to town often, preferring to avoid people in general, but he needed supplies and his horse needed a new shoe. He stopped first at the blacksmith, a burly man named Tom who did good work and did not ask too many questions. While Tom worked on the horse, Bronson walked to the general store. The store was run by a woman named Clara who had to be 70 if she was a day, sharp-eyed and sharp-tongued but fair in her dealings. She looked up when he entered, her eyebrows rising. "Well, if it is not the mountain man himself. What brings you down from your cave, Nash?" "Need supplies," he said simply, pulling out his list. She looked it over and nodded. "I can get you most of this. Going to be about a week for the ammunition, though. Shipment was delayed." "That is fine." He paused, then asked as casually as he could manage, "You know a woman named Grace Brennan?" "Lives in a cabin outside of town." Clara's expression shifted to something like sympathy. "Sure, I know her. Poor thing. Lost her fiancé right before they were to be married. She has been having a hard time of it from what I hear." "Why do you ask?" "Saw her yesterday trying to gather firewood. She did not have near enough for winter, so I helped her out." "That was kind of you." Clara was looking at him with new interest. "She is a good woman, that Grace. Too proud for her own good sometimes, but good. She has been taking in mending work, but there is not much call for it. I have been trying to help where I can, but she does not like charity." "She working today?" "Not that I know of. She usually comes to town on Saturdays to see if there is any work for her." "Why?" Bronson had no good answer for that, so he just shrugged. Clara smiled knowingly, but did not press him. He collected the supplies she had on hand and arranged to pick up the rest when it came in, then headed back to the blacksmith. Tom had finished with the horse and was waiting for payment. As Bronson counted out coins, Tom said, "Heard you asking about Grace Brennan over at the store." News traveled fast in small towns. "Just wanted to make sure she was all right." "She has been struggling," Tom said. "My wife has been trying to get her to accept help, but she is stubborn. If you are looking to court her, you would not be the first. But she has turned down every man who has asked, says she is not ready after losing her intended." "I am not looking to court anyone," Bronson said, though even as he said it he knew it was not true. "Just wanted to help out a neighbor." "Sure," Tom said with a grin that said he did not believe that for a second. "Well, if you change your mind about the courting thing, she is a good woman, deserves someone who will treat her right." Bronson just grunted and led his horse away, his mind churning. He had not thought about courting anyone in years, had assumed that part of his life was over. The war had taken so much from him, including his ability to imagine a future that included anything more than survival. But meeting Grace had awakened something in him, some long dormant hope, and he did not know what to do with it. He should go back to his cabin, he told himself. Get his own place ready for winter, mind his own business, forget about the woman with the gray eyes and the stubborn pride. But even as he thought it, he knew he would not, could not. Instead of heading north to his cabin, he turned his horse east toward the pass that would take him to the higher elevations where the really good timber grew. He had plenty of supplies at his cabin, enough to last the winter and then some. But Grace, even with the wood he had cut for her, might need other things. Meat for the winter, for instance. Preserved fruit. Warmer clothes. He could help with the meat at least. He was a good hunter, one of the best in these mountains. It would be easy enough to take a few extra deer, smoke the meat and bring it to her. And if he happened to check on her while he was at it, make sure she was doing all right, well, that was just being neighborly. The days that followed fell into a pattern that Bronson had not anticipated, but found himself settling into with surprising ease. He spent his days hunting and trapping, preparing his own cabin for winter, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Grace. After a week, he rode back to her cabin with a deer he had dressed and quartered, along with a few pounds of smoked fish and some late-season berries he had found. Grace opened the door looking surprised but pleased to see him. "Bronson," she said, his name coming easily to her lips. "I was not expecting you. Brought you some things," he said, feeling suddenly awkward. "Thought you might could use some meat for the winter." Her eyes went wide when she saw the deer. "That is too much. I cannot accept this." "Already dead," he pointed out. "Would be a shame to waste it. Besides, I have more than I need." She looked like she wanted to argue, but practicality won out. "Thank you, truly. I have been rationing what little I had, and it was not going to last long." He helped her hang the meat in her small root cellar, which was cool enough to keep it from spoiling for a while. She would need to smoke or salt most of it soon, but that was a problem for another day. "Would you like some coffee?" she asked when they were done. "Or are you in a hurry to get back?" "Coffee would be good," he said, even though he had coffee waiting in his own cabin. The truth was he was not ready to leave yet, not when he could spend a little more time in her company. They sat at her table, and this time Bronson could sit in the chair without worrying it would collapse under his weight. The cabin was warmer than it had been on his first visit, and Grace looked healthier, less gaunt and exhausted. "You have been keeping the fire going," he observed. "I have," she said with a small smile. "It seems foolish not to when I have so much wood. I even heat water for baths now, which feels terribly luxurious." "Good. That is what it is there for." They talked easily, more easily than Bronson talked with most people. Grace told him about her life in Ohio before coming west, her work as a seamstress, her hopes for the future that had been upended when her fiancé died. Bronson found himself telling her things he had not talked about in years, about his family's farm in Missouri, about his younger sister who had been the light of his life, about the war and what it had done to him. "You ever think about going back?" Grace asked. "To Missouri, I mean." "Nothing there for me now. The farm was sold for taxes while I was fighting. My parents are buried there and my sister too, but I have no ties to the place anymore." "You get lonely, living alone in the mountains?" Bronson considered the question. "I did not think I did. I figured I was better off alone, that I had nothing left to give anyone. But lately I have been thinking maybe I was wrong about that." Something in his tone made Grace look up, her gray eyes meeting his. For a moment the air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken things, possibilities neither of them had dared to voice. "I should go," Bronson said abruptly, standing up. He was not ready for this, for whatever was building between them. It was too much, too fast, too frightening. Grace stood too, looking disappointed. "Of course. Thank you again for the meat. It will make a real difference this winter." He nodded and headed for the door, then stopped with his hand on the latch. "Grace, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why did you not ask for help?" "In town, I mean." "There are people there who would have helped you if they had known how bad things were." She was quiet for a long moment. "Because I have been helpless before," she said finally. "When my parents died, when my fiancé died, everyone I loved was taken from me and there was nothing I could do about it. I could not control any of it. The only thing I could control was whether or not I asked for charity. It was about pride, yes, but it was also about needing to know that I could take care of myself, that I was not completely powerless." She looked down at her hands. "I know it was foolish. I might have frozen to death because of my pride." "It was not foolish," Bronson said. "I understand needing to feel like you have some control over your life. But Grace, asking for help is not the same as being helpless. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is admit you cannot do it all alone. I am starting to learn that, she said softly. You taught me that when you showed up in the rain and chopped all that wood. You showed me that accepting help does not make me weak. It just makes me human. Bronson felt something in his chest tighten and release at the same time. I will come back, he heard himself say. Check on you from time to time, make sure you are doing all right, if that is okay with you. Grace smiled, and it transformed her face, making her genuinely beautiful. I would like that very much. He left then, before he could do something foolish like pull her into his arms, and rode back to his cabin with his head spinning and his heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with exertion. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm. Bronson found excuses to visit Grace every few days, bringing her things he claimed to have extra of. More meat, some preserved vegetables, a warmer coat that he said did not fit him anymore but which he had actually bought in town specifically for her. She accepted these gifts with grace, no longer fighting him on it, and in return she mended his clothes, cooked him meals, and gave him something he had not had in years: companionship. They talked about everything and nothing. She told him about books she had read, and he told her about the mountains and the animals that lived there. He taught her how to properly maintain an axe, how to tell good firewood from bad, how to read the signs of changing weather. She taught him about things he had forgotten in his years alone, how to laugh at simple jokes, how to appreciate the comfort of a clean home, how to let someone care for him. November arrived with the first real snow, a light dusting that made everything clean and white. Bronson showed up at Grace's cabin with his pack full of supplies and found her standing outside, her face tilted up to the sky, snowflakes catching in her hair. It is beautiful, she said when she noticed him. I have never seen anything so peaceful. First snow is always the prettiest, he agreed, before it gets packed down and dirty. She turned to him and her expression was serious. Bronson, I need to tell you something. His heart kicked in his chest. All right. I know what you have been doing, bringing me things, checking on me. I know you have been taking care of me and I am grateful, more grateful than I can say, but I need you to understand something. She took a breath. When James died, my fiancé, I thought I would never feel anything again. I thought that part of my life was over, that I had used up my chance at happiness. But then you showed up in the rain, and you have been showing up ever since, and somewhere along the way I started to feel things I did not expect to feel. Bronson stood very still, afraid to move, afraid to breathe in case he broke whatever spell was happening. What I am trying to say, Grace continued, her cheeks pink with cold or embarrassment or both, is that I care about you, as more than just someone who has helped me. And if you do not feel the same way, that is fine. I will understand, but I needed you to know. For a long moment Bronson could not speak. Then he closed the distance between them in 2 long strides and cupped her face in his large, calloused hands. Grace, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I have thought about nothing but you since the moment I saw you in the rain. You have gotten into my head and my heart, and I do not know what to do about it except tell you that I care about you too. More than I thought I was capable of caring about anyone anymore. Her eyes were shining with tears, but she was smiling. Really, really. He brushed his thumb across her cheek, marveling at how soft her skin was. I have been trying to figure out how to tell you, trying to work up the courage. I thought maybe you were still grieving for your fiancé, that you would not want someone like me. Someone like you, she repeated. You mean someone strong and kind and good, someone who works until his hands bleed to help a stranger. Someone who makes me feel safe for the first time since I came west. She shook her head. Bronson, you are everything I did not know I needed. He kissed her then, unable to hold back any longer. It was a gentle kiss, tentative, both of them testing this new territory between them. Grace made a small sound and leaned into him, her hands coming up to rest on his chest, and the kiss deepened. When they finally pulled apart, they were both breathing hard, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. "I want to court you properly," Bronson said. "Do this right." "We are standing in the snow in the middle of nowhere," Grace said with a laugh. "I think we have already thrown proper out the window. Still, I want to do this right. I want to marry you, Grace, if you will have me, but I want to give you time to be sure, to know that this is what you want." "I already know," she said simply. "But if you need time to be sure, I can wait." "Not me who needs time," he said. You have been through a lot, lost a lot. I do not want you to say yes to me just because I am here and you are lonely." Grace pulled back a little, looking up at him with those storm-gray eyes. "Do you honestly think I would do that? That I would agree to marry you out of loneliness or convenience?" "No," he admitted, "but I want you to be certain. So I am going to court you through the winter, and come spring I will ask you properly. And if you say yes, then I will know it is real." She looked like she wanted to argue, but finally she nodded. "All right, court me then, Bronson Nash. But I am telling you right now, my answer is not going to change." He grinned, feeling lighter than he had in years. "We will see." The winter that followed was the happiest Bronson could remember since before the war. He spent most of his time at Grace's cabin, helping her with chores, keeping her company, courting her in the old-fashioned way his father had courted his mother. He brought her flowers he had pressed in books, told her stories by the fire, held her hand while they watched the snow fall outside the window. In return, Grace opened her heart to him in ways he had not expected. She told him about her fears and dreams, her regrets and hopes. She let him see her when she was sad, when she was angry, when she was scared. She let him be there for her in ways he had not been there for anyone since the war. They worked together to improve the cabin, making it more comfortable and secure. Bronson repaired the roof where it leaked, built new furniture to replace what Grace had burned, installed proper shutters on the windows. Grace made curtains and cushions, cooked meals that filled the small space with wonderful smells, turned the rough cabin into a real home. It was not all easy. They had their disagreements, their moments of frustration with each other. Grace thought Bronson was too protective, too willing to do things for her that she was perfectly capable of doing herself. Bronson thought Grace was too stubborn, too unwilling to let anyone help her even when she clearly needed it. But they learned to compromise, to communicate, to work through their differences instead of letting them fester. Christmas came, and Bronson surprised Grace with a gift he had been working on for weeks. A rocking chair made from wood he had carved and shaped himself. She cried when she saw it, running her hands over the smooth armrests, sitting in it and rocking gently. "It is the most beautiful thing anyone has ever made for me," she said, tears streaming down her face. Grace gave him a gift, too. A new shirt she had sewn from fabric she had bought with money she had earned from mending. It fit him perfectly, and he knew she must have spent hours getting the measurements right, making sure every stitch was perfect. They celebrated quietly, just the two of them in the cabin, with a small meal and cups of spiced cider. As the fire burned low and the snow fell outside, Bronson held Grace in his arms and thought about how much his life had changed in just a few months. He had been alone for so long, had thought that was his fate. But Grace had shown him that it was possible to love again, to build a life with someone, to hope for a future. January brought brutal cold and deep snow, and Bronson moved into the cabin full-time, sleeping on the floor by the fire. It was not proper, but practicality won out over propriety. It did not make sense for him to trek back to his cabin every night in dangerous conditions, and Grace needed someone there in case something happened. They were careful to maintain separate sleeping areas, aware that Grace's reputation could suffer if anyone knew their arrangement. But in truth, there was nothing improper happening. They were simply two people who cared deeply for each other, trying to survive a harsh winter and growing closer with every passing day. February came, and with it a thaw that turned everything to mud. Bronson used the break in the weather to make a trip to town for supplies, and while he was there, he stopped at the small church. The minister was a kind man named Reverend Peterson, who had served as a chaplain during the war. He and Bronson had spoken a few times over the years, and Bronson trusted him. "I want to marry Grace Brennan," Bronson said without preamble. "Come spring, I wanted to ask if you would perform the ceremony." Reverend Peterson smiled. "I would be honored. I have met Grace a few times. She is a fine woman. You are a lucky man, Nash. I know it. I aim to spend the rest of my life making sure she knows it too." "That is all any of us can do," the Reverend said. "Love them well and show them every day." Bronson left the church feeling like everything was falling into place. He stopped at the general store and bought a length of lace that Clara assured him was the finest she had, which Grace could use to make a wedding dress if she wanted. He also bought a simple gold band that would serve as a wedding ring. It was not fancy, but it was all he could afford, and he hoped it would be enough. When he got back to the cabin, Grace was standing outside enjoying the brief warmth. She ran to him when she saw him, and he caught her up in his arms, spinning her around until they were both dizzy and laughing. "I have something for you," he said when he set her down. He pulled out the lace and the ring box, and her eyes went wide. "Bronson, what is this?" "I know I said I would wait until spring to ask you properly, and I am still going to do that. But I wanted you to have these now, so you could start thinking about what you want for the wedding. If you want a wedding dress, you can make it from this. And this," he opened the ring box, "is for your finger when you are ready." Grace looked at the simple gold band and tears spilled down her cheeks. "It is perfect," she whispered. "Everything is perfect." "Not yet," he said, "but it will be, I promise you that." March brought the first signs of real spring. The snow began to melt in earnest, revealing the green underneath. Birds returned to the trees, and the creek that ran behind the cabin swelled with runoff. Life was returning to the mountains, and with it came a sense of new beginnings. Bronson had been planning his proposal carefully, wanting it to be special. He waited for a day when the weather was particularly beautiful, clear and warm with just a hint of the summer to come. He took Grace on a walk to a spot he had found weeks earlier, a meadow filled with wildflowers, overlooking a valley that stretched out for miles. "This is breathtaking," Grace said, turning in a slow circle to take it all in. "How did you find this place?" "I have been exploring these mountains for years," Bronson said, "but I have been saving this spot for something special." He took her hands in his heart pounding. "Grace Brennan, I know I said I would wait until spring to ask you this, and well, it is spring now, so I am asking. Will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life taking care of you and loving you and building a life with you?" Grace was crying and smiling at the same time. "Yes," she said. "Yes, absolutely yes. I love you, Bronson Nash, and I want to be your wife more than I have ever wanted anything." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. Then he kissed her, pouring all his love and hope and gratitude into that kiss. When they finally pulled apart, Grace was looking at him with such love in her eyes that it nearly broke his heart. "When?" she asked. "When do you want to get married?" "As soon as you are ready." "Tomorrow if you want," she laughed. "I need a little more time than that. I want to make a proper dress from the lace you gave me, and I want to invite a few people from town. Not many, just Clara and Tom and their families, and Reverend Peterson to perform the ceremony, of course." "Whatever you want," Bronson said. "As long as I get to call you my wife at the end of it, you can have anything you want." They spent the rest of the day in the meadow, making plans and dreaming about their future. They would live in Grace's cabin at first, at least until Bronson could build them a bigger house. Maybe higher in the mountains where they could have more land. They would raise animals, maybe chickens and a cow. And children if they were blessed with them. They both wanted children, wanted to create the family that life had taken from both of them. The wedding was set for the first week of May, just over a year after Grace had first come to Nevada. In the weeks leading up to it, Grace worked on her dress while Bronson made improvements to the cabin. He built a proper bed frame to replace the simple cot Grace had been sleeping on, made new shelves for her things, repaired the steps on the porch. The night before the wedding, Bronson stayed at his old cabin, giving Grace space to prepare. He barely slept, too excited and nervous about the day ahead. What if she changed her mind? What if she realized she was making a mistake? The fears plagued him through the long night. But when he arrived at the cabin the next morning, wearing his best clothes and with his hair and beard freshly trimmed, all his fears evaporated. Grace stepped out of the cabin wearing the dress she had made from the lace he had given her, simple but beautiful, and he knew without a doubt that she wanted this as much as he did. The ceremony was held in the meadow where he had proposed, with wildflowers all around and the mountains as witnesses. Clara and Tom were there with their families, and Reverend Peterson performed the ceremony with warmth and humor. When Bronson said his vows, promising to love and cherish Grace for all his days, his voice was steady and sure. And when Grace said hers, promising the same, he saw his whole future in her eyes. They were married as the sun reached its highest point in the sky, and when Reverend Peterson pronounced them husband and wife, Bronson kissed his bride with all the love in his heart. The small group cheered, and Grace laughed against his lips, and Bronson thought he had never been happier in his entire life. There was a simple celebration after, with food that Clara had helped prepare, and a cake that Tom's wife had baked. They ate and talked and laughed, and for a few hours it felt like they were not in a harsh, unforgiving land, but in a place of warmth and community and joy. As the sun began to set, their guests departed, leaving Bronson and Grace alone for their first night as husband and wife. They walked back to the cabin hand in hand, not speaking, both of them overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they had just done. Inside the cabin, with the door closed and the fire burning low, Bronson pulled Grace into his arms and held her close. "I cannot believe you are really mine," he said against her hair. "I have been yours since you showed up in the rain and chopped wood for a stranger," Grace said. "I just did not know it yet. I have been yours since I saw you carrying that pitiful bundle of wet firewood, refusing to give up even though you were exhausted and freezing. You were the bravest thing I had ever seen." They made love that night, gentle and sweet, two people who had been alone for so long finally finding home in each other. And afterward, lying in their new bed with Grace curled against his chest, Bronson felt a peace he had not known since before the war. He had found his purpose, his reason for surviving all the pain and loss. It was this: to love Grace, to protect her, to build a life with her. The summer that followed was full of hard work and happiness. Bronson began building their new house, higher in the mountains as they had planned. Grace planted a garden that flourished in the mountain soil, producing more vegetables than they could eat. They spent their evenings on the porch of the cabin, watching the sun set over the valley, making plans for their future. In August, Grace told Bronson she was pregnant. He was overwhelmed with joy and terror in equal measure. The thought of bringing a child into the world, of being responsible for a new life, was almost more than he could comprehend. But Grace was calm and confident, and her certainty gave him strength. "We are going to be wonderful parents," she said, taking his hands and placing them on her still flat stomach. "This child is going to be so loved." The new house was finished just before the first snow fell. It was bigger than the cabin, with 2 rooms downstairs and a loft above that would serve as bedrooms for their future children. Bronson had built it with his own hands, every board and nail placed with care, and when they moved in, Grace cried happy tears. "It is perfect," she said, walking through the empty rooms. "It is everything I dreamed of." They spent their first winter in the new house preparing for the baby. Bronson built a cradle from smooth pine, carving little animals into the headboard. Grace sewed tiny clothes and blankets, preparing for the arrival of their child. They talked late into the night about names and what kind of parents they wanted to be, their hopes and dreams for this new life they had created together. The baby came in March, during a late snowstorm. The midwife from town had been staying with them for a week, waiting for the birth, and when Grace's labor began, she took charge with calm efficiency. Bronson was banished from the room but stayed just outside, pacing and praying and generally being useless. When he finally heard his child's first cry, he nearly collapsed with relief. The midwife opened the door with a smile. "You have a son," she said, "a big, healthy boy, and your wife is doing well." Bronson stumbled into the room and saw Grace holding a small bundle, her face exhausted but glowing. "Come meet your son," she said softly. He approached slowly, almost afraid, and looked down at the tiny face. The baby had Grace's nose and Bronson's dark hair, and he was the most beautiful thing Bronson had ever seen. "Hello, little one," he said, his voice breaking. "I am your father, and I am going to love you so much." They named him Benjamin Thomas Nash, after both their fathers, and from the moment he was born he had them both wrapped around his tiny finger. Bronson was a devoted father, getting up for late-night feedings, changing diapers without complaint, walking the floor with Benjamin when he was fussy. Grace watched her husband with their son and fell even more in love with him, if that was possible. The years passed in a blur of happiness and hard work. Benjamin grew from a baby into a toddler into a small boy who looked just like his father and had his mother's gentle heart. When he was 3, Grace became pregnant again, and this time they had a daughter they named Sarah Grace. 2 years after that came another son, James, named for Grace's brother who had died in the war. Their house on the mountain was filled with laughter and love, with the sounds of children playing and parents who adored each other. Bronson built additions as their family grew, adding rooms and a bigger porch. Grace's garden expanded every year, and she became known throughout the area for her preserves and pickles. Bronson never went back to his solitary ways. He had found something better than solitude. A family, a purpose, a reason to get up every morning. He worked hard providing for them, hunting and trapping and doing odd jobs for people in town when the money was tight. But he was always home by supper, always there to read bedtime stories and kiss scraped knees and tell his children how much he loved them. Grace thrived as a wife and mother. The grief and loneliness that had defined her early months in Nevada were replaced with joy and purpose. She was active in the small church community, helping new families who came to the area, sharing what she had learned about surviving in the harsh mountain environment. On quiet nights, after the children were asleep, Bronson and Grace would sit on their porch and watch the stars. Sometimes they talked about the past, about how unlikely it was that they had found each other. Other times they just sat in comfortable silence, hands intertwined, grateful for every moment they had together. You ever think about that day? Grace asked one night when Benjamin was 5 and Sarah was 2 and Grace was pregnant with James. "The day you first saw me carrying firewood in the rain." "All the time," Bronson said. "I think about how I almost rode past, almost minded my own business. I think about what my life would be like now if I had." "Empty," Grace said, "like mine would be without you." "I was so angry at the world back then," Bronson continued. "Angry about the war, about losing my family, about everything. I thought I wanted to be alone. But really I was just scared, scared to care about anyone because I could not stand to lose anyone else." "What changed?" "You did. I saw you struggling, and something in me woke up that I thought had died. I knew I could not ride past, could not leave you to freeze. And once I stopped, once I let myself care about what happened to you, everything else just fell into place." Grace leaned her head on his shoulder. "You saved my life that day. I would not have made it through the winter without the wood you chopped. I was too stubborn to admit how bad things were, too proud to ask for help. But you helped anyway, even though I tried to refuse." "Best decision I ever made," Bronson said, kissing the top of her head. "Marrying you, building this life with you, it is more than I ever thought I deserved. You gave me back my future, Grace. You gave me hope." "We gave each other hope," Grace corrected. "We saved each other." The years continued to pass, each one bringing new joys and challenges. Benjamin grew into a strong young man who looked so much like his father it was almost eerie, but who had his mother's gentle way with words. He loved the mountains and the animals that lived there, and Bronson taught him everything he knew about hunting and trapping and living off the land. Sarah was a spirited child with a will of iron and a heart of gold. She reminded Bronson of his sister, the one he had lost so long ago, and sometimes when he looked at her, he felt like he had been given a second chance. She was fearless and kind in equal measure, and he knew she would grow up to be a remarkable woman. James was the baby, at least for a while, quiet and thoughtful where his siblings were boisterous. He loved books and learning, and Grace spent hours teaching him to read and write. He was the one who would probably leave the mountains someday, who would want to see what else the world had to offer. But Bronson was not worried. He knew that no matter where his children went or what they did, they would carry the love he and Grace had given them. When Benjamin was 12, Sarah was 9, and James was 7, Grace sat Bronson down one evening and told him she was pregnant again. He was surprised. They had thought their family was complete, but the surprise quickly turned to joy. "Another blessing," he said, pulling her into his arms. "Another piece of our hearts running around causing trouble. This pregnancy was harder than the others." Grace was older now, nearing 40, and the baby seemed to take more out of her. Bronson worried constantly, hovering over her until she finally told him to go chop some wood or hunt something because his anxiety was making her anxious. The baby, another boy they named Daniel, arrived safely in the spring. He was small but healthy, with a thatch of dark hair and eyes that would eventually turn the same storm gray as his mother's. Bronson held his fourth child and marveled that he had gone from a solitary mountain man to the father of 4, and that every moment of it had been worth it. As the children grew, Bronson and Grace grew older together. His beard went from dark to gray, and lines appeared around Grace's eyes from years of smiling. Their bodies showed the wear of hard work and raising children, but neither of them minded. They had earned every wrinkle and gray hair, earned them through love and laughter and building a life together. Benjamin was the first to leave home, at 18, heading to California to try his hand at ranching. It broke Grace's heart a little, but she was proud of him for being brave enough to forge his own path. Sarah followed a few years later, marrying a young lawyer in town and moving to Reno. James, as Bronson had predicted, went east to attend college, hungry for knowledge and new experiences. Daniel, the youngest, stayed close to home. He loved the mountains as much as his father did, and he took over more and more of the work as Bronson's joints began to ache with age. By the time Daniel was 20, he was essentially running things, though he always deferred to his father out of respect. Bronson was 64 and Grace was 61 when they celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary. Their children all came home for the occasion, bringing spouses and grandchildren. The house was full of noise and love. 3 generations gathered to celebrate the love story that had started with a mountain man seeing a woman carrying firewood in the rain. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Bronson and Grace walked outside and looked up at the stars, just as they had done countless times before. 30 years, Grace said softly. It feels like yesterday and forever at the same time. Best 30 years of my life, Bronson said. His hair was completely gray now, his beard long and white, but his eyes still held the same intensity they had when he first saw her. Every single day with you has been a gift. You have any regrets? Grace asked. Things you wish you had done differently? Bronson thought about it seriously, then shook his head. Not a single one. Everything, every choice, every moment led me to you and to this life. How could I regret any of it? Grace smiled, the moonlight catching the silver in her hair. I love you, Bronson Nash. I loved you when you were a lonely mountain man chopping firewood for a stranger, and I love you now as a grandfather surrounded by family. You are the best thing that ever happened to me. Right back at you, Bronson said, pulling her close. You took a broken man and put him back together. You gave me a reason to live, to hope, to love. Everything good in my life comes from you. They stood there under the stars, holding each other, 2 people who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances and had built something beautiful together. Around them, the mountains stood silent and eternal, witnesses to a love story that had started 30 years ago in the rain and would last until the end of their days. Inside the house, their children and grandchildren slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that they were loved and that they came from love. Benjamin and Sarah and James and Daniel, along with all the grandchildren, they were the legacy of that day in the rain when a mountain man saw a woman in need and chose to help. They were proof that love could grow even in harsh conditions, that kindness could change lives, that 2 broken people could heal each other and create something lasting and true. Years continued to pass. Bronson's health began to fail as he approached 70, his strong body finally showing the wear of decades of hard work. Grace nursed him through bouts of illness, just as he had cared for her during difficult pregnancies and times when she was sick. They took care of each other, as they always had. Daniel and his wife lived in the house with them now, helping with the daily chores and making sure the older couple was never alone. Grace's garden still flourished, though Daniel's wife did most of the heavy work now. Bronson still sat on the porch most evenings, watching the sun set over the valley, Grace beside him in her rocking chair, the one he had made for her so many years ago. Tell me again, Grace said one evening when Bronson was 72 and she was 69. Tell me about the day we met. Bronson smiled. He had told this story countless times to their children and grandchildren, but Grace never tired of hearing it. It was October and raining something fierce, he began. I was heading to town when I saw you through the rain, carrying firewood and looking more determined than a whole army. You were soaked to the bone and could barely carry that little bundle of sticks, but you were not giving up. I was so stubborn, Grace said with a laugh. You were surviving, Bronson corrected. And when I offered to help, you tried to refuse because you are the proudest woman I have ever known. But I could not leave you, Grace. Something in me knew even then that you were going to be important to me. That helping you was going to change everything. It did change everything, Grace said, for both of us. I chopped enough wood to last you through the winter, Bronson continued. And then I kept coming back, kept finding excuses to see you, until finally I could not pretend anymore that I was just being neighborly. I was in love with you, probably from that first day, even if it took me a while to admit it. We built a good life, Grace said, reaching over to take his hand. We raised good children, we loved each other well. We did it right, Bronson. We did, he agreed, squeezing her hand. No regrets, not a single one. That night, lying in bed with Grace curled against him just as she had been for 30 years, Bronson felt a deep peace. His body was failing, he knew that, but his heart was full. He had lived a good life, a life filled with love and purpose. He had found his person, his home, his reason for being. I love you, he whispered into the darkness. I love you too, Grace whispered back. Always. Bronson lived another 3 years, long enough to see 2 more grandchildren born and to celebrate 73 years of life. When he finally passed, it was peacefully in his sleep, with Grace beside him and his family surrounding him. His last words were "thank you," though no one was quite sure if he was talking to Grace, to God, or to life itself for giving him so much. Grace grieved deeply, as anyone would after losing their partner of 35 years. But she took comfort in their children and grandchildren, in the life they had built together, in knowing that Bronson had died happy and loved. She lived another 5 years, staying in the house he had built with Daniel and his growing family. She tended her garden and rocked in the chair Bronson had made for her, and told stories to her grandchildren about the mountain man who had saved her life and stolen her heart. When Grace finally passed, at 74, she was laid to rest beside Bronson on the hill overlooking their house. Their children erected a simple stone marker that read, "Bronson and Grace Nash. They saved each other." The house remained in the family, passed down through the generations. Daniel's children inherited it, and then their children, each generation adding their own touches but keeping the core of what Bronson had built. The story of how Bronson and Grace met became family legend, told and retold at gatherings, a reminder of where they came from and what they were built on. The cabin where Grace had lived when they first met, where Bronson had chopped all that firewood on that rainy October day, still stood. It was maintained as a kind of shrine, a place where family members could go to feel connected to their past. The shed where Bronson had stacked the wood was still there too, weathered but standing, a testament to his craftsmanship and his love. More than 100 years after that day in the rain, descendants of Bronson and Grace still lived in the mountains of Nevada. They were ranchers and teachers, doctors and artists, scattered across the country, but tied together by the love story that had started it all. At family reunions, someone would always tell the story again, about the mountain man who saw a woman carrying firewood in the rain and decided to help, who chopped enough to last her through the winter, who ended up giving her his whole heart. And in the telling and retelling, the story became more than just history. It became a reminder of what was possible when you chose kindness, when you helped someone in need, when you opened your heart to love even when you were scared. It was a reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of compassion could change the course of a life, could create ripples that spread far beyond what you could imagine. Bronson had been right that day in the rain when he had told Grace about his sister, about how no one had helped her when she needed it. He could not save his sister, but he had saved Grace. And in saving her, he had saved himself. Together, they had created something beautiful and lasting, a love that transcended time and became the foundation for generations of family to come. The mountain still stood, eternal and unchanging, keeping watch over the valley where Bronson and Grace had built their life. The seasons still turned, winter to spring to summer to fall, year after year, decade after decade. But the love story that had started there, on a rainy October day in 1878, that love story lived on, told and retold, a testament to the power of compassion and the enduring nature of true love. And if you went to that house on the mountain, the one Bronson built with his own hands, and sat on the porch in the evening as the sun set over the valley, you could almost feel them there. Bronson and Grace, young and in love, old and content, together always, their story woven into the very foundation of the place. A reminder that love can grow anywhere, even in the harsh mountains of Nevada, even between two people who had given up on happiness. All it took was one person seeing another person in need and deciding to help. One act of kindness that changed everything. That was the legacy of Bronson and Grace Nash, not just the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren they left behind, but the example they set. Love fiercely, help generously, hold unto each other through whatever storms life brings. It was a simple message but powerful, and it lived on long after they were gone. A light in the darkness, a warmth in the cold, proof that happy endings were possible if you were brave enough to take the first step.